The first time Henry Hayes rode into Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1878, he made a silent promise to himself that he would not speak to a single soul unless the matter involved whiskey or horses, and he intended to keep that promise right up until the moment Martha Winslow stepped off the westbound stage with a broken trunk, a lopsided hat, and a voice that carried across the entire width of the main street like a church bell caught in a windstorm. Henry had been leaning against the post outside the livery stable, chewing a strip of dried venison and watching the stage come in the way. A man watches weather roll across a flat plain with mild interest and no intention of getting involved. He had ridden 240 miles from St. Louis to get away from involvement. He had left behind a law practice that had slowly strangled him, a fiancée who had married his business partner without much ceremony or apology, and a grief over his younger brother that had settled into his chest like a stone he could not pass. Caldwell, Kansas, sitting right on the edge of the Kishom Trail with cattle dust in its teeth and a permanent scent of horse sweat in the air, seemed like exactly the kind of place where a man of 32 could disappear into honest, uncomplicated work without anyone asking him questions about his feelings. He had already arranged to take on a job at a nearby cattle ranch owned by a man named Elias Prout, who needed someone who could read contracts and also ride a horse without embarrassing himself, a rare enough combination that Prout had hired him on the spot. Henry planned to work the land, keep to himself, sleep without dreaming too much, and eventually figure out what came next. That was the whole plan. It was a simple plan. It was, he thought, a good plan. Then the trunk fell off the top of the stage and split clean in half on the packed dirt street, and a woman he had never seen before stood looking down at the ruins of what appeared to be several years of accumulated life, and she said, loudly and with remarkable clarity, "Well, that is just about perfect." Henry stayed where he was. He watched the stage driver shrug, with the particular indifference of a man who had seen worse. He watched the other passengers step carefully around the spilled contents, which included 2 dresses, a medical bag that clinked with glass bottles, a considerable number of books, and what appeared to be an entire set of kitchen implements wrapped in newsprint. He watched the woman. She was maybe 26 or 27, with dark brown hair coming loose from its pins in a way that suggested the whole arrangement had been fighting a losing battle since at least Wichita, and a practical brown traveling dress that was dusty at the hem but carefully mended at the cuffs crouched down, and began collecting her things with the focused calm of someone who had already had the feeling sorry for herself portion of this experience, and was now moving efficiently past it. She looked up and caught him looking. She had sharp green eyes that held absolutely no self-pity whatsoever, which he found unexpectedly interesting. "Are you going to stand there chewing that piece of leather, or are you going to help me?" she asked. Henry looked at the venison in his hand. He looked back at her. "I was planning on standing here," he said. "Wonderful," she said, turning back to her books. "Then you will have an excellent view of the effort." He told himself he was only crossing the street because his legs had decided to do it without asking his opinion, which was a lie his legs had apparently agreed to tell. He crouched down across from her and picked up a volume that had landed face down in the dirt. He turned it over. It was a medical text, Gray's Anatomy, 1858 edition. He looked at the medical bag with new understanding. "You are a doctor," he said. "I am a trained nurse," she said, not looking up from the newsprint-wrapped bundle she was attempting to rewrap. "Caldwell apparently has no doctor within 30 miles, and the town council wrote to the nursing board in Kansas City 4 months ago requesting placement. I am the placement." She paused, finally looked at him. "I am Martha Winslow." "Henry Hayes," he said. "Mr. Hayes." She nodded, precise and businesslike. "Are you a resident of Caldwell?" "As of this morning." "Then you are already acquainted with this town's complete lack of a medical facility, I assume." "I have not been here long enough to be acquainted with much." "No matter," she said, standing and brushing dirt from her knees. "I will find it myself. I find most things myself." He stood as well, arms full of her books. He looked at the books and then at her and understood that he was apparently going to carry them wherever she was going, because walking away at this particular moment with her books still in his hands would be peculiar. He had walked himself directly into a situation, which was exactly what he had come to Caldwell to avoid. Martha Winslow looked at him holding her books, and something in her expression shifted just slightly, a softening so brief he might have imagined it. "There is no need to trouble yourself further," she said. "I have already troubled myself," he said. "Might as well finish the journey." Her mouth curved at one corner. It was not quite a smile, but it was adjacent to one. "The boarding house is on the far end of Oak Street," she said. "Mrs. Greer runs it. I have been corresponding with her." "Lead the way," he said. So Henry Hayes, who had come to the Kansas territory specifically to be left alone, walked down the main street of Caldwell carrying an armload of medical books belonging to a woman he had met approximately 4 minutes ago. And he was, if he was being honest with himself, not nearly as irritated about this as he should have been. Mrs. Greer turned out to be a small, wide woman with iron-gray hair and the cheerful efficiency of a person who had long ago decided that life was difficult, and the only sensible response was to make very good biscuits. She had a room ready for Martha, and she looked at Henry over Martha's shoulder with the frank appraisal of a woman who had seen many young men and was already filing him into some category in her considerable mental ledger. "You one of Pruett's boys?" she asked him. "Starting next week," he said. "Good man, Pruett. Fair wages, and he does not cheat on the feed." She said this as though it were the highest moral praise available, which in Caldwell in 1878 it possibly was. She turned back to Martha. "Supper at 6, Miss Winslow. I will have a bath ready for you at 4 if you want it." Martha's face did something complicated at the word bath, something that suggested that the offer of a bath after however many days on a stage was roughly equivalent to being offered entry into paradise. "That would be wonderful," she said, with a warmth in her voice that Henry noticed was considerably softer than the tone she had used with him. He set her books down on the table in the front hall. He had nothing more to do here. He said goodbye to them both and walked back out onto the street, back into the particular quiet of a prairie town in the middle of the afternoon, when the cattle drive has not yet come through, and the saloon is not yet busy, and the whole place has the held-breath quality of something waiting to happen. He told himself he would not think about her green eyes or the way she had said, "I find most things myself," with a matter-of-factness that suggested a great deal of history in those 4 words. He was mostly successful. He went back to the livery stable and arranged stabling for his horse, a dark bay gelding named Reckoning who had been with him since Missouri and had very strong opinions about oats versus hay. He found himself a room at the other boarding house, run by a man named Calhoun who did not make good biscuits but charged less and asked fewer questions. He ate supper alone and went to bed early and slept better than he had in 6 months. In the morning he rode out to meet Elias Pruett. Pruett's ranch, the Double Cross, sat about 9 miles northeast of Caldwell on land that still felt raw and new the way Kansas land often did, as though the sky and the earth had not yet agreed on exactly where to draw the line between themselves. Pruett himself was a heavy-set man of about 50, with a neat gray beard and eyes that had been squinting at cattle and weather and men long enough that they had settled permanently into an expression of thoughtful evaluation. He shook Henry's hand with both of his and said, "You read Latin?" Henry blinked. "I do, yes." "Good," Pruett said. "The land grant deed is partly in Latin, and the county surveyor keeps trying to convince me that his interpretation is the correct one and my north pasture belongs to his brother-in-law. It does not." He clapped Henry on the shoulder. "Come have coffee, and we will talk about what I need from you." What Pruett needed was someone who could manage the paperwork end of a cattle operation that had grown faster than his ability to keep up with it. Contracts with the trail bosses who drove his cattle up to Abilene, land agreements, payroll, correspondence with buyers in Kansas City and Chicago. He also needed someone who could ride, because papers did not write themselves in a ranch office when cattle were scattered across 9,000 acres. Henry could do all of it. He had spent 3 years as a land contract attorney in St. Louis before the personal unraveling had made staying there impossible, and he had grown up on a horse on his father's farm in Missouri before going east for school. He settled into the work with a gratitude that surprised him. There was something clarifying about physical labor after years of sitting at a desk. He rose before dawn and rode out with the hands to check fence lines or move cattle or track down the perpetually escaping Northwest herd that seemed to believe the property line was a suggestion. He came back in the afternoon to the office, a spare room in Pruitt's main house, and worked through the correspondence and contracts until supper. He ate with the ranch hands, a mixed group of men who included a quiet Texan named Cole Briggs, who was the best roper Henry had ever seen, a Mexican cowboy named Santiago Vila who had a gift for calming spooked horses, and a Scottish immigrant named Angus McRae who seemed to regard the entire American frontier as a personal challenge he intended to defeat through sheer stubbornness. Henry liked them. He had not expected to. He had expected to maintain the kind of professional distance that he had maintained in St. Louis, where relationships had felt like obligations and obligations had felt like ropes. But Cole and Santiago and Angus were uncomplicated in their friendships in the way that men who worked hard and slept hard and relied on each other tended to be. And Henry found himself drawn in before he had properly decided whether to be drawn in or not. He rode into Caldwell on Friday afternoons for supplies and to check the post, and for the first 3 weeks he managed not to encounter Martha Winslow at all, which he privately attributed to the town being just large enough and his own discipline being just sufficient. On the 4th Friday, he turned a corner near the general store and nearly walked directly into her, because she was walking with her face turned upward looking at the sky the way she might have been reading it, and he was looking at a list of supplies in his hand, and they collided with enough force to scatter the papers she was carrying in every direction. "Mr. Hayes," she said, crouching immediately to collect them. He was already crouching too, reflexively, and their hands arrived at the same paper at the same moment and stayed there for a second too long. "Miss Winslow," he said, "I apologize. I was not watching where I was going," she said. "I was looking at that cloud formation over the South Ridge. That particular pattern in late April often indicates a late-season hail storm within 24 hours. The Caldwell weather here is considerably more volatile than Kansas City, and I have been trying to learn its patterns." She paused. "I am sorry, that is probably more information than you wanted." "No," he said, and meant it. "Is that from a meteorology text?" She looked at him with the cautious expression of someone who had explained things to people before and been laughed at for it. "From observation mostly," she said. "And yes, some reading. Are you familiar with meteorology?" "I read a paper about storm systems on the plains last year," he said. "Lauren Blodgett's work." The cautious expression shifted into something genuinely pleased. "You have read Blodgett. I would not have expected that from a ranch hand." "I was a lawyer before," he said. "I read things." He stood. The street continued its business around them. "How are you finding the Pruitt Ranch?" she asked, and the question was so natural, so simply curious, that he answered it the same way. "Good," he said. "Honest work. I sleep well." Something in her face told him she understood the significance of that last part, the sleeping well, in a way that did not require explanation. "I am finding Caldwell more interesting than I expected," she said. "They gave me a room above the hardware store for my clinic. It is not much, but it is sufficient. I have already seen 11 patients in 3 weeks. What are the primary complaints? Broken bones from the cattle work mostly. One case of typhoid that I am monitoring carefully. A good deal of infected wounds that have gone untreated too long because the nearest doctor is in medicine lodge, and men out here apparently believe that ignoring an injury will eventually cause it to fix itself." She said this with the resigned patience of someone who had been fighting this particular battle for some time. "Does it?" he said. "The injuries? No, Mr. Hayes, they do not fix themselves. They become septic, and then we have a much larger problem than we started with." She tucked her recovered papers under her arm with decisive efficiency. "I have a patient in 15 minutes. Good day." "Good day," he said. He stood in the middle of the street and watched her go, which he had absolutely not intended to do. She walked quickly, purposefully, with none of the performative femininity of movement that was common in Kansas City or St. Louis, where women were expected to manage the contradiction of appearing both fragile and ornamental at all times. She walked like someone who had somewhere to be and intended to get there. He realized he was still standing in the street. He picked up his supply list and went to the general store. The spring deepened into early summer, and the Kishom Trail began sending its long cattle drives through the lower end of the county, and Caldwell took on the particular electric quality that a cattle town acquires when money and motion and a great many bored cowboys arrive simultaneously. Henry worked harder during drive season, managing contracts with trail bosses who came through Pruitt's land and negotiating fees and rights-of-way that required a combination of legal knowledge and the kind of direct plain speaking that lawyers in St. Louis offices had not generally required. He was good at it. He had always been good at the thinking end of things. It was the feeling end that had given him trouble. He ran into Martha with increasing frequency, which he eventually acknowledged was partly due to circumstances, and partly due to the fact that his Friday route through town had begun to include a pass near the hardware store where her clinic was, at roughly the time she tended to step outside for air between patients. He did not examine this too closely. They had fallen into a habit of brief conversations that were always interesting and occasionally surprising. He had brought her a book about botanical medicine that he had found in a box of miscellaneous volumes at the general store, and she had looked at it with an expression of genuine delight before saying thank you with the direct simplicity of someone who did not believe in false modesty about receiving a thing they actually wanted. He had found himself looking forward to those conversations more than he wanted to admit. It was Cole Briggs who said something first, with the tactful bluntness of a Texas ranch hand. "That woman from the clinic," Cole said one evening, not looking up from the harness he was mending. "You going to court her, or are you just going to keep accidentally meeting her in the street every Friday?" Henry did not answer for a long moment. "I came here to be left alone," he said. Cole kept working the leather. "Seems to me," he said, in the measured way he had, "that being left alone and being lonely are two different things, and sometimes a man gets them confused." Henry did not have a good response to that, so he said nothing, which Cole apparently took as an adequate acknowledgement because he did not press the point. The thing that changed the balance was a Thursday evening in June when Henry rode into Caldwell for a delivery and found Martha Winslow on the street outside the hardware store with a situation on her hands. A cattle drive had come through that afternoon and left behind a cowboy with a badly broken arm. The bone had snapped under a fall from a spooked horse, a clean break but a severe one. And the cowboy, a young man of about 20 named Pete Delaney from a drive out of Texas, was sitting on the steps of her clinic in considerable pain, while Martha argued with his trail boss, a barrel-shaped man named Garrett, about the fee for treatment. Henry could hear the argument from half a block away. Garrett was saying that the fee was unreasonable and that Pete could ride on with the drive and see a real doctor in Wichita, and Martha was saying that riding 50 miles on a horse with a broken ulna would cause permanent damage that no doctor in Wichita could undo, and her voice was completely steady but her knuckles were white around the door frame she was gripping. Henry tied reckoning to the post and walked over. "There's a problem here," he said. Garrett looked at him with the assessing eye of a man used to measuring other men quickly. "No problem that concerns you," he said. "This woman is trying to charge me $6 for setting a bone, which is robbery." $6 is the standard fee for a fracture reduction, Martha said tightly. And I am also charging for the splinting materials and the laudanum, which brings it to $8.50 in total, which is not robbery. It is medicine. Pete can ride, Garrett said. Pete cannot ride, Martha said. Pete will lose the use of that arm if he rides. Henry looked at Pete Delaney, who was 17 or 18 at the most, white as chalk, holding his arm against his chest with his eyes glazed with the particular suffering of someone trying very hard not to cry and largely failing. He looked at Garrett. "Pay the woman," Henry said. Garrett looked at him. Something in Henry's face, or perhaps in the way he was standing, apparently conveyed that this was not a suggestion that invited debate, because after a moment Garrett's jaw worked silently, and then he reached into his coat and counted out the money, and set it on the step next to Pete with a thump that conveyed his feelings on the matter. He left without another word. Martha looked at Henry. There was something in her eyes that was complicated and difficult to read, gratitude and irritation tangled together. "I could have handled that," she said. "I know," he said. "I handled it anyway." She held his gaze for a moment, and then she said, "Could you help me get him up the stairs? He is heavier than he looks, and I cannot set the bone properly with him sitting on these steps." "Yes," he said simply. Pete Delaney's arm was set and splinted, and the young cowboy, who turned out to be genuinely good-natured despite his pain, thanked Martha no fewer than 6 times during the procedure, and told her she had the gentlest hands he had ever encountered on a medical person. Martha said that was probably because she was not a doctor, and Pete said he did not see how that made a difference. And Martha laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of her, and Henry sat in the chair in the corner of her clinic and felt something shift inside his chest like ice breaking in a river. Pete was left to rest on the narrow cot in the back of the clinic, while Martha washed her hands at the basin and Henry remained sitting in the corner, not having had any particular reason to leave yet and not being in a hurry to find one. The clinic was small and spare and scrupulously clean. She had whitewashed the walls herself. He had learned from Mrs. Greer, had scrubbed the floors with lye, had organized her medical supplies with the precision of someone who understood that in the absence of abundance, order was the next best thing. "You should charge more," he said. She dried her hands. "I charge what the book says is standard." "The book was written in 1865, he said. "Prices have gone up." She turned to look at him. "How do you know what year the pricing guide was written?" He had no good answer for that, because the honest answer was that he had been in her clinic twice before on minor pretexts and had looked at her bookshelf. "I made an educated guess," he said. She sat down in the chair across from him, the small space between them close enough that he could have reached out and touched her hand if he had wanted to, which he was firmly not thinking about. The late evening light came through the single window and lit the side of her face, and she looked tired in the particular way of someone who works very hard at something she believes in entirely. "Why did you really come to Caldwell?" she asked, not unkindly. The way she asked questions, direct, genuinely curious, without ornament, was something he had begun to identify as simply the way she was. He considered not answering. He considered a partial answer. "I needed to start over somewhere that did not already know the story of what went wrong," he said. She nodded slowly. "Yes," she said. "I understand that." He looked at her. "Why did you come?" She was quiet for a moment. "My mother died 2 years ago," she said. "She was the last of my family in Kansas City. My father died when I was 12. I trained as a nurse partly because we needed the money and partly because I found I was good at it and it was useful. And after my mother was gone, there was nothing holding me to Kansas City. The nursing board offered the placement here, and I thought, a place where no one knows you and you get to be exactly who you are without anyone trying to decide what that looks like." She paused. "Similar reasoning, I think, to yours." "Similar reasoning," he agreed. The room held the particular quiet of 2 people who have said honest things and are sitting with the weight of them. Outside, Caldwell continued its evening, the distant sound of the piano at the Longhorn Saloon, someone's horse on the packed dirt street, the faint smell of cookfire smoke. "Thank you," Martha said, "for earlier, with Garrett. You said you could have handled it yourself." "I could have," she said. "But I am glad I did not have to." He walked back to his horse and rode back to the Double Cross in the warm June dark and told himself, with somewhat less conviction than he had felt 6 weeks ago, that he had come to this territory to be left alone. He told himself this. He was not sure he believed it anymore. It was Angus McRae who noticed the change first, which Henry would not have predicted because Angus's method of noticing things generally involved less observation and more volume. "You've been whistling," Angus said one morning over breakfast, with the manner of a man reporting a significant irregularity. Henry had not been aware that he had been whistling. "Have I?" he said. "Started about 2 weeks ago," Angus said. "Something cheerful. Cole thinks it is a hymn. I say it is not a hymn. Santiago says it does not matter what it is as long as you keep doing it because you have been considerably less like a thundercloud than you were when you arrived." Angus scratched his beard. "Is it that nurse in town?" Henry looked at his coffee. "Mind your business, McRae." Angus took this as a yes, which it was. Henry rode into Caldwell the following Tuesday. For no particular reason, he was prepared to state aloud, and he stopped at the general store and bought a jar of the preserved peaches that Mrs. Greer had mentioned Martha was fond of, and then he stood outside the general store with the jar of preserved peaches in his hand and had a quiet but thorough argument with himself about what exactly he was doing. He was not a young man given to foolish impulses. He was 32 years old and had been, until recently, a reasonably rational person. He was also, he acknowledged, standing on a street in Caldwell, Kansas, with a jar of peaches, and the only place those peaches were going was the clinic above the hardware store. He went. Martha was between patients. She opened the door and looked at the jar in his hand and then at his face, and she said, "Mrs. Greer told you." "Mrs. Greer mentioned them," he said. She took the jar. She looked at it the way she looked at things she was genuinely pleased by, with a quiet, private pleasure that she did not seem to feel any need to perform. "Thank you, Mr. Hayes," she said. "Would you like to come in? I have coffee on the stove." "I would," he said. They sat at the small table she used for paperwork when the clinic was not in use for patients, and she poured coffee into 2 tin cups and they talked for an hour. He did not fully remember afterward exactly what they had talked about, the cattle drives, and what their passing did to the local water sources. A book about prairie botany she was reading, a question she had about a land dispute that had come up between 2 of her patients, and whether he thought it had legal merit. The sky that morning, which had been a specific shade of rose gold that she said she had never seen in Kansas City. He remembered that she laughed twice, and that her laugh was the kind that started in her eyes before it reached her mouth. He remembered that she asked questions about his childhood in Missouri, and listened to the answers with the focused attention that was characteristic of her, as though everything he said was worth the effort of understanding. He rode back to the ranch and spent 20 minutes very deliberately not examining his feelings, after which he gave up and acknowledged to himself that he was, with the comprehensive thoroughness that characterized most things he did, falling in love with Martha Winslow. This was inconvenient. This was also, he was beginning to suspect, possibly the best thing that had happened to him in several years. He began to court her in a manner that was appropriately measured for a man of his particular combination of genuine interest and habitual caution, which is to say, he brought her books when he found ones he thought she would like, and he stopped by the clinic on his Friday supply runs with enough regularity that it could no longer be characterized as accidental, and he invited her to supper at the hotel dining room one evening in early July with a directness that surprised even him a little. She accepted with the same directness. "Yes," she said, "I would like that." The supper was everything a supper in a Kansas cattle town could reasonably be expected to be, which was good beef and decent bread and coffee that was better than average. in a room that smelled of sawdust and cooked grease, and the particular mineral quality of air that had never had a chance to move very far from the open land outside. Henry wore his better coat. Martha wore a blue dress he had not seen before, a deep, particular blue that turned her green eyes into something astonishing, and she had her hair arranged neatly at the back of her head, and she looked at him across the table and said, "You brushed your coat." "I did," he said. "Good," she said. "You looked like you needed to." He laughed. It surprised him, the realness of it, the ease of it. He had not laughed that way in a long time, the kind that comes from being genuinely caught off guard by something delightful. "You are not how I expected," he said. "How did you expect me?" "I am not entirely sure," he said honestly, "but not like this." "Like what?" He thought about it. "Easy," he said, "in the specific sense of comfortable, not because it requires no effort but because the effort feels natural." She considered this for a moment, her fingers wrapped around her coffee cup. "I was told once," she said, "by a man I was briefly engaged to when I was 23 that I was too direct for a woman and that I would be better received if I learned to be less immediately honest about what I thought." She paused. "He married someone else. She seems very happy. So does he, genuinely, which I do not begrudge him, but I could not stop being direct. It was like trying to stop being right-handed." "Who told you directness was a flaw?" Henry said. "Most of Philadelphia," she said dryly. "I grew up there before my father died and we moved to Kansas City for his family." She smiled, and it was a real smile, the full kind. "But that was a long time ago." "We're engaged in Philadelphia." "Kansas City," she said. "He was a doctor. He wanted a wife who would manage his social calendar and organize dinners and be quiet about her own opinions. I was apparently not that." She looked at him. "You were engaged in St. Louis." It was not a question. He looked at her. "Mrs. Greer," he said. "Mrs. Greer," she confirmed, unapologetically. She mentioned it in the context of saying you were a good man who had a difficult time and did not deserve it. "She is very fond of you, Mr. Hayes," which is considerable praise given that she is also deeply fond of very few people. Henry set down his fork. The thing about honest people, he had found, was that they created an atmosphere in which dishonesty felt particularly uncomfortable. "Her name was Clara," he said. "We were engaged for about a year. She and my business partner, I think they genuinely fell in love. I do not entirely blame either of them. But it was the combination of that and losing my brother that same winter that—" He stopped. Martha waited. She had a way of waiting that was not pressure, was simply space. "My brother Thomas died in November of 1876, Henry said. "An accident on the river. He was 28. He was the better of us, honestly more generous, more patient, better with people. The engagement ended 2 months later. I left St. Louis in March and rode west." He picked up his fork again. "And ended up in Caldwell, where I intended to mind my own affairs." "And then I dropped my trunk in the street," Martha said. "And then you dropped your trunk in the street," he agreed. The evening deepened around them, the dining room emptying of its other customers, the sound of the street outside going quieter as the summer dark settled in. They stayed until Mrs. Hensley, who ran the hotel and combined the duties with a motherly impatience for people who lingered past 8 o'clock, began conspicuously stacking chairs at the nearby tables. They walked back together toward Oak Street, under a Kansas sky that was doing its particular nighttime thing of being so large and so full of stars that it felt almost aggressive in its beauty. They stopped at the gate of Mrs. Greer's boarding house. The gate was a simple wooden one, slightly crooked, that Mrs. Greer had been meaning to fix for 2 years. Henry looked at Martha Winslow in the starlight and said, "I would like to call on you properly if you are willing." She looked at him. She was not a woman who looked away or down. She looked straight at him. "I am willing," she said. "I want to be honest with you, Henry. May I call you Henry? I am not looking for something brief or casual. I have lived enough of my life already, and I know what I want from the rest of it, and it is not to be courted gently for 6 months and then left at a gate." The fact that she had used his given name went through him like a warm current. "I am not a brief or casual man," he said. "No," she said. "I did not think you were." She held his gaze. "Good night, Henry." "Good night, Martha," he said. He walked back to his horse feeling something he could not entirely name, something that was partly happiness and partly a kind of wonder. At himself, at this, at the fact that the world had apparently not finished surprising him. The weeks that followed were among the most thoroughly alive Henry had felt in years. He called on Martha twice a week, on Friday afternoons when he came into town for ranch business, and on Sunday mornings when the ranch was quieter and he could ride in without obligation pulling him back. They walked together along the creek south of town, where cottonwood trees grew thick and the water was low and clear in the summer heat, and they talked about everything: his life in Missouri, her training in nursing, the books they had both read, the state of Caldwell's growing pains as a cattle town, the question of territorial governance and what Kansas statehood had and had not delivered for the people who actually lived on the land. She had opinions. Strong ones, delivered with the same direct clarity as everything else she did. She thought the cattle drives were economically necessary and personally catastrophic for the small settlements along the trail. She thought the treatment of the Wichita people and the Osage who had been pushed off this same Kansas land was a moral stain that no amount of economic progress could adequately address, and she said this in the same matter-of-fact tone she used for everything, as though these were not controversial statements but simply true ones. He found himself agreeing with her, which was simultaneously gratifying and slightly alarming, because he had not expected to find someone out here whose moral compass was this carefully maintained. "You are the most thoroughly consistent person I have met," he told her one afternoon, sitting on the bank of the creek with their shoes off and their feet in the cold water, which was a liberty that would have been scandalous in St. Louis, and which they had both apparently decided Caldwell's particular informality made acceptable. She looked at him with a small, pleased expression. "Is that a compliment?" "It is the highest compliment I know how to give," he said. She was quiet for a moment, the water running over her feet, the cottonwood leaves moving above them in the afternoon breeze. "I think," she said carefully, "that you are the first man I have ever met who finds that interesting rather than exhausting." "Who found it exhausting?" "My former fiancé, primarily. My father had a limited tolerance for it as well. Many of my nursing supervisors." She tilted her face up toward the light coming through the leaves. "Women are not generally supposed to be consistent in their opinions. We are supposed to adjust them to match whoever is in the room." "That sounds profoundly uncomfortable," Henry said. "It sounds like a way to disappear," she said quietly. "I refuse to disappear." He reached over and took her hand, which was lying on the bank between them, and she turned to look at him, and he said simply, "I am glad." She looked at their hands. She turned hers over and laced her fingers through his with the same deliberate, careful quality that she brought to every action. "So am I," she said. They stayed like that for a long time, the creek talking to itself around their feet and the summer going gold above the prairie. August arrived with heat so comprehensive that Caldwell seemed to hold its breath through the worst of the afternoon, and the cattle drives thinned, and the town settled into the particular rhythm of a place between its busy seasons. Henry continued his work at the Double Cross, and the work continued to be satisfying. But he had begun to think about what came after, whether Prout might sell him a parcel of land at the eastern edge of the property that had good water access, and sat on a rise that looked out over a view so wide and clear that looking at it felt like a physical relief. He had mentioned it casually to Prout once, and Prout had looked at him with the thoughtful, evaluating expression that meant he was genuinely considering something. He had also begun to think about what came after in terms of Martha, which was a kind of thinking that would have been terrifying to him 4 months ago and which now felt simply necessary. He was not a man who had ever been good at the in-between state of things, the courtship dance of ambiguity. He knew what he felt. He had known with increasing certainty for weeks. The question was the manner of it. He asked Mrs. Greer for advice, which in retrospect was the most sensible thing he had done in months. Mrs. Greer sat him down with coffee and her excellent biscuits and regarded him with the benign interest of a woman who had been watching this develop since approximately the second Friday of May. "Martha Winslow," she said, not as a question. "Yes," he said. "You want to ask her to marry you?" "Yes," he said. "Then ask her," said Mrs. Greer. "She is not a complicated woman, Mr. Hayes. She is a direct woman, which some people confuse with complicated because they are accustomed to people saying things they do not mean. Martha says exactly what she means. If she wants to marry you, she will tell you so. If she does not, she will tell you that as well, and it will sting, but you will survive." Henry turned his coffee cup in his hands. "And your opinion?" Mrs. Greer smiled, and it was a warm smile, the kind that came from genuine affection. "I think you are exactly what the other needs," she said. "She needs someone who will let her be herself completely, and you need someone who will not let you disappear into your own head. You have both been doing your vanishing acts for long enough." He rode back to the ranch and sat on the fence of the east pasture while the sun went down behind the flat horizon and thought about Thomas, his brother. The way Thomas had been so thoroughly present in his own life, in every room he entered, engaged with the people around him, the way Henry had always struggled to be. He thought about the year and a half since Thomas had died, and how he had spent it trying to become small enough to stop feeling the loss, and how it had not worked, how the grief and the loneliness had just followed him here to Kansas and sat outside his door in Calhoun's boarding house every night. He thought about Martha Winslow, who had arrived with a broken trunk and refused to be small, who said exactly what she meant, who was right now 9 miles away, providing medical care to cattle hands and homesteaders and passing cowboys and anyone else who needed it, in a tiny whitewashed room above a hardware store, and doing it with a thorough, fierce competence that moved him deeply. He thought about Thomas and thought, "You would have liked her enormously." And he thought that Thomas would have said, with the directness he shared with Martha, "Then what exactly are you waiting for?" He went to Martha on the next Sunday morning, not the afternoon walk but the morning, and she was on the steps of the clinic with a coffee cup when he rode up, as though she had expected him or had simply got up early, and she looked at him coming up the street, and there was something in her face that told him she already knew what he was coming to say. He dismounted and tied reckoning and climbed the steps and stood in front of her. "Martha," he said, "I intend to ask you something important, and I would like you to listen to the whole of it before you answer, although I recognize that asking you to hold your response is somewhat contrary to your nature." She looked at him with the expression that was near laughter but held back, the corner of her mouth. "I will do my best," she said. "I came to this territory to be left alone," he said. "That was the entire plan. The plan was solitude and honest work and not having to feel things for a while until I had figured out how to do it without it costing so much. You did not cooperate with the plan. You were not quiet or invisible or uninteresting. You were the opposite of all three things, and I stopped minding that very quickly, which surprised me considerably." He paused. "What I am trying to say is that the version of this life that I can imagine now has you in it. Not in it in the peripheral way of a pleasant acquaintance, but in it completely, as my wife, as the person I come home to, as the person I intend to spend the rest of my life being thoroughly and happily and inconveniently in love with." He reached into his coat pocket and produced a ring, a simple gold band with a small turquoise stone that he had bought from a Wichita silversmith who had come through Caldwell the previous week, because turquoise was the color of the creek on a clear afternoon, and he had thought of her when he saw it. "I would like to marry you, Martha Winslow. I would like it very much." She had held her response as long as she was capable of holding it, which had not been particularly long. She set down her coffee cup on the step beside her. She stood up, which brought her close to him, close enough that he could see the particular brightness in her eyes that was not tears but was adjacent to them, the welling of something real and glad. "Yes," she said. "Henry, yes. I have been waiting for you to do this for 6 weeks, which I recognize is an ungraceful thing to admit, but you know I do not manage ungraceful admissions particularly well." He laughed, the same free laugh as the hotel dining room, surprised out of him. He took her hand and put the ring on her finger, and she looked at it for a moment, at the turquoise against her skin, and something in her face was so soft and so open that he felt the full weight of the privilege of being trusted by someone this private with something this tender. He kissed her, there on the steps of the clinic above the hardware store, with Caldwell beginning to move around them, and the August morning hot and bright, and the prairie stretching out in every direction as far as the eye could reach. She kissed him back with the same completeness she brought to everything, entire, genuine, without reservation. Cole Briggs, who happened to be passing on the street below with a load of supplies, observed this and said nothing, and rode on with the expression of a satisfied man who has been proven right about something he was not willing to gloat about, at least not until he got back to the ranch. They were married in October of 1878 at the small Methodist church on the north end of Caldwell that had been completed only that spring, its white paint still fresh enough to smell of timber and linseed oil. The ceremony was performed by the Reverend Miles, a tall, thin man from Ohio, who had come west with the conviction that the frontier needed saving, and had been mildly surprised to find that it was mostly just people trying to farm in difficult conditions. The church was full. Mrs. Greer in the front row with a new bonnet, Cole and Santiago and Angus McRae filling an entire pew with their combined physical presence, Elias Prout and his wife Clara beside them, a good number of Caldwell residents who had become fond of Martha in the months since her arrival, and who had apparently been waiting for this development with the patient interest that small towns bring to the lives of their members. Martha wore the blue dress. Henry wore his better coat. She had added a small spray of dried prairie flowers to her hair, yellow ones, and when she came down the aisle toward him, he thought she was the most beautiful person he had ever seen in his life, and he thought this with the full sincerity of a man who had not previously been given to hyperbole. She reached him and looked at him with that direct, clear gaze. "You look terrified," she said quietly, without moving her lips much, which he appreciated. "I look joyful," he said, equally quiet. "Those are similar in facial expression." She made the small sound of almost laughter. Reverend Miles began. The vows were the traditional ones, simple and old and worn smooth by use. Henry said them and meant every word with a completeness that felt like physical weight in his chest. Martha said them, and her voice did not waver and her eyes did not leave his. When Reverend Miles said they were married, Cole Briggs let out a single quiet word of approval, and Angus McRae clapped with the enthusiasm of a man who has been holding his feelings in for the duration of the ceremony, and is now releasing them all at once. The reception was in the cleared yard of Mrs. Greer's boarding house. There was roast beef and corn bread, and a cake that Mrs. Greer had made herself, which was the finest cake most of the attendees had ever encountered on the Kansas frontier. And there was music provided by a fiddler named Denny who played with the kind of joyful sloppiness that is far more enjoyable than precise playing. Henry danced with Martha in the light of the paper lanterns that someone had strung between the boarding house and the old oak tree, and she danced with complete unself-consciousness, no performative grace, just the genuine pleasure of moving to music with someone she wanted to be close to. And he held her, and the night was warm for October, and the stars were doing their enormous Kansas thing overhead, and he thought, "Here. This is where I am meant to be." She pressed her cheek against his and said into his ear, "You are still whistling." "Am I?" he said. "Under your breath," she said. "You have been whistling all evening, something cheerful." "It is not a hymn," he said. She laughed against his shoulder. They had taken a house. Elias Prout, with characteristic practicality and genuine generosity, had sold Henry the parcel he had wanted on the east edge of the Double Cross at a fair price. And Henry had spent September working alongside Cole and Santiago, building a two-room house on the rise above the creek. A solid frame structure with a good roof, and a stone fireplace that Cole insisted on as a concession to winter, and a south-facing window that looked out over 40 miles of prairie. It was simple and clean, and had the quality of something built with attention, and Martha had walked through it when it was finished and run her hand along the window frame of that south-facing view and said, quietly, "Yes," which Henry understood was not a response to any spoken question but to something larger. She kept the clinic in town, which they both understood was not negotiable. She rode in 3 days a week and stayed 2 of those nights at Mrs. Greer's, and Henry adjusted his schedule to match, riding in on clinic days to do ranch business in town and riding back with her when she was ready. It was not a conventional arrangement by the standards of 1878, which were not flexible on the subject of what a married woman's life was supposed to look like. But Caldwell had made its peace with Martha Winslow being her own person before she had been in town 3 weeks, and the people who came to her clinic cared considerably more about the quality of her care than about whether she had given up working to keep house. The first winter in their house on the rise above the creek was one of the hardest on record for southern Kansas, with storms coming down from the north in January that buried the prairie under 2 feet of snow and locked everything in a cold so thorough that even the double-crosses cattle had to be brought into the covered pens. Henry and Cole and Santiago worked 17-hour days during the worst of it, and Martha, who had been running a fever clinic for 3 weeks as influenza moved through the homesteader families along the creek, came home on the worst evenings with the particular exhaustion of someone who has been needed for longer than they have the reserves to sustain. He would have supper on the stove on those nights, nothing elaborate but hot, and she would come through the door and he would take her coat and she would sit at the kitchen table and let herself be taken care of for a little while, which she did not find easy but which she was learning, and he would put the plate in front of her and sit across from her, and they would talk about the day, the patients she had seen, the fence line that had come down in the northwest corner, the letter from Kansas City that had arrived for her, the situation with the Granger family whose homestead was failing and who were 2 months from leaving. They talked about everything. They talked the way people do when they have found in each other someone who genuinely wants to know the thing being said. Henry had not known this kind of conversation before Martha, had thought himself constitutionally unsuited to it, had believed that his preference for solitude was some permanent and irreducible feature of his character. He was finding out that solitude had been a preference born of the absence of someone right, and that what he had actually wanted all along was not to be alone, but to be with exactly this person. In March she told him she was pregnant. She told him on a Sunday morning, sitting across from him at the kitchen table with both hands around her coffee cup, looking at him with the expression of someone who has an important piece of news and is not entirely sure how the recipient is going to receive it. He looked at her face for a moment, the particular tension in it, the hope held carefully behind her eyes, and then he got up from his chair and came around the table and crouched down next to her chair and took her hands in both of his. "Are you well?" he said. "Yes," she said. "I am well, I am, yes." "Are you happy?" he said. She looked at him, and the tension left her face and she was simply happy, entirely and without complication, and she said, "Yes, Henry, I am very happy." He put his head against her shoulder and she put her arm around him, and they stayed like that for a long time, while the March light came through the south-facing window and the prairie, still brown from winter, waited for spring. The pregnancy complicated the clinic's schedule, and Martha reorganized it with her characteristic practical intelligence, coming into town 2 days a week instead of 3, and working with Mrs. Greer and a capable woman named Ruby Hollister, who had some nursing experience from the war, to cover the days she was not there. She was characteristically unromantic about the physical experience. She described its challenges with the same factual clarity she brought to medical cases, which Henry found both useful and occasionally alarming, and she refused to reduce her activity beyond what was medically necessary, which led to exactly one serious argument between them in which he said he was worried about her, and she said she was a trained nurse and understood her own body better than he did, and both of these things were true. And they arrived at a compromise that was essentially a formalization of what she had already planned to do, which she acknowledged with the grace of someone who understood that the argument had been about love and not control. The compromise involved him riding her into town on clinic days instead of her riding alone, which she called unnecessary, and which she also appeared to enjoy, because the rides in were 40 minutes of uninterrupted time together in the wide spring air. And they talked, and sometimes she would point at the sky and explain a weather pattern, and he would ask questions. And once she had fallen asleep against his shoulder on the way back in the last warmth of a May afternoon. And he had held the reins steady and not woken her, and felt a happiness so uncomplicated it was almost shocking. Their son was born on a Tuesday in early August of 1879, attended by Ruby Hollister and a doctor from Medicine Lodge named Whitmore, who had come up specifically because Martha had written to him, not because she needed his help, but because she had professional respect for his skills and wanted a second pair of hands she trusted. Henry spent the night in the kitchen with the door open, which Martha had both insisted upon and then appeared to be quietly grateful for. And when Whitmore came to the door at 4 in the morning and said the baby had arrived, Henry walked into the bedroom, and the world had changed in the interim. Martha was exhausted and flushed and looked at him with eyes that were full of everything she felt, and in her arms was a boy with a furious red face and a remarkable amount of dark hair. And Henry sat on the edge of the bed, and Martha put the baby in the crook of his arm, and he held his son for the first time, and his son looked up at him with the unfocused, earnest gaze of a person just arrived, and Henry said, "Hello," and meant it with the whole of himself. They named him Thomas James Hayes. Thomas for his uncle, who deserved to be remembered by something living and forward-moving. James for Martha's father. They called him Tom almost immediately because the name suited him. He was, from the first weeks, a cheerful and vigorous person with strong opinions about when he wished to be held, and a laugh that arrived early and stayed frequent. Henry wrote to his parents in Missouri with the news, the first letter of any real warmth he had sent them in 2 years. His mother wrote back, a letter so full of relief and love that he had to put it down twice before he could read it to the end. She said she had been so worried about him. He wrote back that she did not need to worry anymore. The months that followed had the quality of deep, particular happiness, not the dramatic happiness of courtship, but the richer, quieter happiness of a life being built. Henry took on more responsibility at the Double Cross as Pruett's health began to show the wear of 30 years of ranching, and there were genuine conversations about Henry eventually buying the operation, which was a possibility that had not occurred to him when he had arrived in Caldwell with nothing more ambitious than getting through each day, but which now seemed not only possible but right. Martha's clinic expanded. The town council, persuaded partly by the demonstrated need and partly by the petition signed by every homesteader family within 15 miles of Caldwell, approved funding for a proper clinic building on the south end of the main street. It was small, 2 examination rooms, a waiting area, a small storage room for supplies, but it was real, and it had the town's name on the deed. And when they nailed the sign to the door that said Caldwell Medical Clinic, Nurse Martha Hayes, Martha stood in front of it for a moment with the look of someone quietly completing something. She turned to Henry, who was holding Tom on his hip. Tom was 9 months old and had recently discovered that grabbing at Henry's hat was amusing and had not stopped doing it. "Nurse Martha Hayes," she said, "that is the first time I have seen my name on something official that includes yours." "How does it look?" he said. She looked at it again, then at him, with the full warmth that she reserved for moments when she allowed herself to feel everything at once. "Exactly right," she said. Cole Briggs got married that November to a schoolteacher named Ellen who had arrived in Caldwell in September to run the new school, And Martha was a guest of honor at the wedding, and Henry was the best man. And the entire thing had a rightness to it that felt like the country settling into itself. Santiago Vila rode south in the spring to take a position on a ranch in Texas closer to his family. And there was a genuine sadness at his departure because he had been a good man and a good friend. And Henry wrote him a letter twice a year after that and got letters back with the news of his life, which was, by all accounts, a good one. Angus MacRae remained at the Double Cross with apparently no intention of ever leaving, a fixture as permanent and argumentative as the stone fireplace he had insisted Henry build. The second year brought the natural complications of the life they had built, a drought in late summer that scared everyone along the creek, a dispute with the county surveyor that Henry spent 3 months resolving through the kind of patient, detailed legal work that reminded him he had been good at his profession before he had been unhappy in it. Martha's clinic weathered an outbreak of scarlet fever in the late fall that required weeks of sustained effort and left her thin and exhausted in December. And Henry spent that December running the house and minding Tom and making sure she ate, reversing the care of the hard winter before in a way that felt natural and necessary. She came to him on a January evening when the snow was back on the prairie and Tom was asleep and the house was warm and quiet, and sat beside him on the bench by the fireplace and leaned her head against his shoulder and said, "I have been thinking." "What about?" he said. "About whether I told you enough," she said. "About what this has meant." "What you have meant." He put his arm around her. "You tell me," he said, "in your way." "I was going to do all of this alone," she said quietly. "I had decided that entirely. The clinic and the work and the life here, I was quite prepared for it, and I think I would have been mostly fine." She paused. "But fine and this are not the same country at all." He turned and pressed his lips to the top of her head. "No," he said, "they are not." She tilted her head up to look at him. "You came here to be left alone," she said, and there was the particular warmth in her voice that she kept for things she found both funny and tender simultaneously. "I did," he said. "I did not get that message," she said. "No," he agreed, "you did not." "Do you mind?" she said, not anxiously. Martha Winslow did not ask anxious questions. She asked honest ones and wanted honest answers. He looked at her, at the woman who had stepped off a stage with a broken trunk and sharp green eyes, and no interest whatsoever in becoming invisible, who had refused to be quiet or small or convenient, who had walked into his carefully constructed solitude and simply inhabited it without asking permission, who had somehow in the process of doing exactly what she had come to do made room for him to become more himself than he had been in years. "Martha," he said, "I stopped minding approximately 14 minutes after I met you." She smiled, the full smile, the real one that started in her eyes. 14 minutes, she said. "That long?" "I am a stubborn man," he said. She laughed, and it filled the warm kitchen and reached the sleeping child in the next room, who stirred briefly and then settled. And outside the Kansas winter pressed its cold face against the windows, and the prairie held its enormous breath under the snow, and the fire was warm, and Henry Hayes, who had come to the territory to be left alone and had been thoroughly and gratefully defeated in this ambition, held his wife and felt the stone he had carried in his chest for 2 years simply gone. Not slowly dissolved, not gradually worn away, but present and then not present, replaced by something larger and warmer and entirely alive. Spring came back to Kansas as it always does, without apology, simply arriving one morning with the smell of mud and green things, and the particular light that comes only when snow has just released the ground and everything is beginning again. Tom took his first steps in that spring, in the kitchen on a Saturday morning while Henry and Martha were both watching from opposite sides of the room, holding their breath, and Tom walked 3 steps from his mother's hands to his father's with the focused concentration of someone attempting something important, and landed against Henry's chest with a thump and a gleeful shout of satisfaction that startled the dog sleeping under the table. Henry looked across his son's head at Martha, who was laughing, and the look between them contained everything. The year and a half just passed, the years ahead, all of it. And Martha reached over and put her hand against Henry's cheek and said, "There he is," meaning Tom, meaning the man Henry had become, meaning something she did not need to put into full sentences because they had been learning each other's language for 2 years, and it was by now fluent between them. Elias Prout came to Henry in the summer of 1880 with a proposition. His health had been failing for a year, quietly but undeniably, and he wanted to sell the double cross while he could still do it right, to someone who understood it and would not break it up or let it fail. He wanted to sell it to Henry. The price was fair. Prout was a fair man, and had no interest in extracting the maximum from someone he liked and trusted. He said he wanted Clara to be in Kansas City near her sister, that Kansas winters had cost them both enough, and he wanted the ranch to keep being what it had been without his having to watch it from his sickbed. Henry went home and told Martha that evening. He laid it all out, the price, the terms, what it would require of them, the risk and the possibility both. Martha listened to all of it the way she listened to everything, completely, without interruption. When he finished, she said, "Is this what you want? Not what makes the most financial sense or what Prout needs. What do you want?" He thought about it honestly. "Yes," he said, "this land, this work, I want it." "Then yes," she said, "we do it." They did it. Henry signed the papers in August and became the owner of the Double Cross, 9,000 acres of Kansas grassland with 6 permanent ranch hands, and a cattle herd that was, in Cole's estimation, the finest in the county. It was enormous, and it was terrifying, and it was exactly, precisely right. Angus McRae's response to the news was to buy a bottle of whiskey and deliver a toast of such length and genuine sentiment that Cole had to intervene at around the 15-minute mark, and even then Angus managed another 3 minutes before he was steered toward the bunkhouse. Cole shook Henry's hand with both of his and said, "Good," which from Cole was equivalent to a standing ovation. The autumn of 1880 was full in every sense of the word. Tom was walking everywhere and had recently developed an opinion about horses that Henry was both alarmed and delighted by, because at 14 months Tom had already made it clear to Reckoning that they were going to be friends whether Reckoning agreed or not, and Reckoning, perhaps sensing a kindred spirit in the stubbornness department, had accepted this. Martha was expecting their second child, which she announced with the same direct, pleased simplicity as the first. The ranch work was hard and good and all-consuming, and Henry managed it the way he managed everything that mattered to him, with total commitment and occasional panic, that he kept off his face in the interest of the people who depended on him. There were difficulties, because life in 1880 Kansas was not without them. A dispute with a neighboring property owner named Carver, whose cattle had been drifting onto Double Cross land, and whose response to requests for remediation had been escalating hostility, required the kind of careful, documented legal approach that took Henry 3 months and cost him more than one restless night. It was resolved, finally and entirely, when Henry filed the correct instruments with the county court and produced the survey documents that the Latin language deed had contained all along, the ones that established the Double Cross's north pasture border beyond any reasonable challenge. Carver was unhappy but had no legal recourse, which was the best possible outcome. Martha's second pregnancy was easier than the first, she said, which Henry interpreted as meaning it was difficult but within the range of manageable. She continued her clinic days through the 7th month, at which point she and Ruby Hollister agreed that Ruby could carry the clinic for the last 2 months, and Martha could be available for consultations from home. Martha's definition of consultations from home turned out to include a good deal more writing out to patients than Henry was entirely comfortable with. But he had been married to her for 2 years, and he understood that there were conversations worth having, and conversations that would simply exhaust both of them without changing anything. Their second son, James William Hayes James again for Martha's father, William for Henry's was born in March of 1881, also on a Tuesday, which Martha noted with the tone of someone filing a date appoint. James was larger than Tom had been and quieter in temperament, given from his earliest days to a focused, watchful quality that was recognizable to Henry because it was his own trait mirrored back to him in the face of this new person. Martha looked at James when he was 2 weeks old and said, "He is going to be a thinker," and Henry said, "I hope he has better timing about it than I did." And Martha said, "I will make sure he does," with the serene confidence of someone who had no doubt about her ability to shape the outcomes of the people she cared for. Tom, at nearly 2, regarded his brother with the suspicious assessment of someone who had been the sole authority in his domain and was now being asked to revise the organizational structure. He adapted within a week, at which point his approach to James was one of proprietary affection, and Henry caught him on more than one occasion sitting next to the baby's cradle explaining things to James in the solemn tones of a senior official briefing a new recruit. The years layered themselves, each one distinct, none of them ordinary. Caldwell grew, the cattle trade ebbed and flowed with the economics of the trail. The town's character shifted as the drives became less central and the farming families became more numerous. And with the shift came new needs and new complexity. Henry served on the county land committee for 2 terms, because the experience of the Carver dispute had shown him that the machinery of legal land use was imperfect enough, that it needed people inside it who understood both the law and what the land meant to the people living on it. Martha expanded the clinic twice and trained 2 additional nurses, and eventually, in 1884, succeeded in convincing a young doctor from Iowa named Dr. Abel Marsh to come to Caldwell, a negotiation that had taken her 2 years of correspondence and the construction of a proper physician's surgery as part of the town's new civic building. When Marsh arrived, he spent his first week essentially following Martha around the clinic taking notes, which he said without any embarrassment was the most useful week of his professional education. Henry and Martha had their 3rd child in 1884 as well, a girl, their daughter, whom they named Eliza Jane Eliza for no particular person, but because Martha had loved the name since she was small, and Jane for Henry's mother in Missouri. Eliza arrived with an opinion about everything and the voice to express it, and was from the beginning the most thoroughly confident person in the Hayes household, which was a statement of some significance, given that her brothers and her parents were none of them given to doubt. Henry's parents came to visit from Missouri in the autumn of that same year, a journey his mother had been proposing for 2 years and his father had been finding reasons to delay. And when they arrived, Henry could see in his father's face the specific relief of a man who had been worried and is no longer worried, who can see with his own eyes that his son is well and more than well, that the life spread out before them, the house on the rise above the creek, the children. The woman standing at the door with Eliza on her hip, and the particular composed ease of someone entirely in possession of her own life, is real and good and lasting. His mother cried when she held Tom and James, who were 5 and 3, and had the boundless energy and total indifference to personal dignity that belonged to small boys given outdoor lives. She held Martha for a long time on the evening of the 2nd day, and said something to her that Henry could not hear from across the kitchen, and Martha met Henry's eyes over his mother's shoulder with the expression she wore when something moved her, and he knew without knowing the exact words that his mother was saying thank you. His father walked the north pasture with him the morning before they left, the 2 of them riding side by side in the early October cool, and his father was quiet for a long time in the way of a man assembling something carefully. "Thomas would have liked this," his father said finally, "this place." "I know," Henry said. "I think about that." "He would have liked her," his father said. "I think so too," Henry said. His father looked out over the pasture, at the wide flat line of the horizon and the enormous sky over it. "I was afraid," his father said, That you were going to disappear into yourself after Thomas died, that we were going to lose 2 sons." Henry was quiet for a moment. The horses moved beneath them, easy and comfortable. "I tried," he said. "I rode out here to manage exactly that." "What stopped you?" Henry thought about a woman stepping off a stage with a broken trunk and eyes that held no self-pity whatsoever. He thought about being handed her books and finding himself walking down a Caldwell street before he had properly made the decision to do so. He thought about 14 minutes. "She did not cooperate," he said. His father looked at him and smiled, and it was a smile that carried a great deal inside it, relief and pride and love, and the particular happiness of a father who can see his son's life and see that it is good. The Pruitts sent a letter from Kansas City in 1885 to say that Elias had passed in his sleep, quietly, which was the way he would have wanted to go. No drama, just an honest ending to an honest life. Henry wrote back to Clara Pruitt with a genuine tribute, because Elias Pruitt had given him the job that had given him the beginning, and there was nothing false or obligatory in the gratitude he felt. He read the letter to Martha, and she sat with it for a moment and said, "He was a good man," simply, which was the most honest epitaph she could have given. The ranch continued. The children grew with the particular speed that children have, as though the years were happening faster for them than for their parents. Tom at 7 was already riding and helping with the lighter cattle work, and had, as promised, made Reckoning his particular horse, Reckoning now being an elderly and philosophical animal who had apparently decided that a relationship with the next generation of Hayeses was an acceptable final chapter. James at 5 was the bookish one, as Martha had predicted, already reading beyond his years with the focused patience of someone who finds in books what Henry had once found in them before he had stopped reading for pleasure. Not escape exactly, but depth, other worlds to measure his own against. Eliza at 1 was, simply, Eliza, which was sufficient description. Martha built a garden at the south side of the house that first spring after Eliza was born, a kitchen garden with practical herbs and vegetables, but also in the far corner, a bed of flowers that had no medical application and were planted purely because she wanted them, which Henry regarded as evidence of an interior adjustment in someone who had spent her whole professional life defending the usefulness of everything she did. She had stopped needing to justify the things she loved. He thought that was important. He thought it was one of the things a life should do for a person, if the life was good. On a June evening in 1885, 7 years after a broken trunk had scattered someone's books across a Caldwell street, Henry found Martha standing at the south-facing window of their house, looking out over the prairie in the long golden light of the late evening. Tom and James were outside still, their voices carrying in the warm air. Eliza was asleep, for once, which was an event of sufficient rarity that both her parents moved carefully so as not to disturb the conditions that had produced it. Henry stood beside Martha at the window. The view had not changed since the first time she had stood here and said yes to it. 40 miles of grass and sky, the creek glittering in the distance, the wide, flat miracle of the Kansas horizon. It was, he had always thought, a view that required nothing added to it. It was complete in itself. "What are you thinking?" he said. She turned to look at him, and in the late light her face had the quality it always had when she was in the middle of something real, open, clear, entirely herself. "I am thinking," she said, "that I came here to do useful work in a place that needed it, and I expected the work to be enough." "Was it?" he said. She looked back at the window, at the prairie going gold in the long light, and then at him again with the full warmth that she reserved for things she was allowing herself to feel entirely. "No," she said, "it was not enough on its own. The work is good. The work matters, but the rest of it," she put her hand on his chest over his heart, the simple, familiar weight of it. "The rest of it is what makes the work sustainable. Do you understand the distinction?" "Yes," he said. "You," she said. "The boys." "Eliza, this house, this view," she paused. "You came here to be alone." "I did," he said. "And I did not understand that," she said, and her mouth curved. "You understood it perfectly," he said. You simply chose not to honor it. I was very busy with my broken trunk, she said. He laughed and put his arms around her from behind, and she leaned back into him. And they stood at the window of their house and watched the light go golden, and then rose, and then the deep, clear blue of a Kansas dusk. And the voices of their children came through the summer air. And the creek caught the last of the light in the distance. And somewhere out on the prairie a bird was singing a single clear note over and over. And the world was large and good and theirs. And Henry Hayes, who had ridden 240 miles to disappear, held the woman who had found him anyway and was grateful, with the whole of himself and every year he had, that she had not gotten the message. In the years that came afterward, and there were many of them, full and various and good people in Caldwell would sometimes ask how they had met, the doctor's nurse and the ranch owner, and Martha would tell the story of the trunk with the particular dry pleasure she took in things that were genuinely funny, and Henry would add the part about the books and the 14 minutes, and Martha would say that 14 minutes was an exaggeration on the generous side. And Henry would say it was if anything a conservative estimate, and they would look at each other across whatever room they were in, with the private completeness of two people who have been each other's best company for long enough, that the language between them is largely unspoken, and whoever was listening would understand that this was a love story, had always been a love story, from the moment a broken trunk had hit a Caldwell street, and a woman with green eyes had looked up at a man chewing dried venison and declined to be politely ignored. Tom Hayes grew to be a rancher like his father, broad-shouldered and capable and quietly funny, with his mother's eyes and his father's patience. He married a girl from Wichita named Anna at 22 and brought her to the Double Cross, and she and Martha took to each other immediately in the manner of women who recognize in each other someone who will not waste their time. James Hayes became a physician, as his mother had perhaps always suspected he would, training in Kansas City and then in St. Louis, and coming back to Caldwell with a medical degree and a thorough grounding in the practical realities of frontier medicine that his mother had insisted upon supplementing his formal training with throughout his entire upbringing. He worked alongside his mother's clinic for a year before she officially retired from the nursing work and handed it to his care, at which point she became what she had possibly always been most naturally suited to be, a consultant, available to everyone, bound by nothing, answering to her own excellent judgment. Eliza Hayes confounded all reasonable predictions by becoming a lawyer, which Henry found deeply satisfying in a way that Martha observed was probably some form of poetry, and Henry agreed it very likely was. She studied in Kansas City and practiced land law in Wichita, and was, by all accounts, formidable. She had Henry's thoroughness and Martha's directness in a combination that her opposing counsel found genuinely difficult to work around. On their 25th anniversary, in the autumn of 1903, when the children were grown, and the Double Cross had been one of the most successful cattle operations in the Kansas Territory for a decade, and Martha's clinic had become the cornerstone of Caldwell's medical infrastructure for 25 years, Henry and Martha stood at the south-facing window of their house on the rise above the creek and watched the October light lie gold across the grass, and it was the same view it had always been, unreduced by familiarity, still requiring nothing added to it. 25 years, Martha said. 25 years, Henry agreed. She turned to look at him. The years had put lines at the corners of her eyes and gray in her dark hair, and none of it diminished the directness of her gaze or the quality of her presence, which had always been the particular quality of someone entirely inhabiting their own life. She was 53 years old, and she was entirely herself, and he loved her with the comprehensive, specific love of a man who knows exactly what he has. "Any regrets?" she said. "About which part?" "About all of it," she said. "Caldwell, the ranch. Me not getting the message." He looked at her for a long moment, at the woman who had picked up her scattered books with the focused calm of someone who had already moved past self-pity, who had walked him down the street carrying his obligations with no particular ceremony, who had looked at him across a supper table and said, "I have been waiting for you to do this for 6 weeks without embarrassment," who had said yes to everything. The house on the rise, the children, the life, him with the same complete, unqualified yes. "Not one," he said. She took his hand. Outside, the Kansas evening settled into its enormous self, and the creek caught the last of the light, and somewhere in the house behind them there was the sound of grandchildren arriving, Tom's Anna calling ahead of herself, the door opening on the warm noise of a family assembling itself, and Martha turned toward it with the expression she always had for the people she loved, open, clear, entirely glad. And Henry Hayes, who had come to the territory to be left alone and had been the better for being found, followed his wife toward the sound of his life and was home.